Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Wolverines, the largest land-dwelling members of the weasel family, once roamed across the northern tier of the United States and as far south as New Mexico, in the Rockies, and southern California in the Sierra Nevada range. But after more than a century of trapping and habitat loss, wolverines in the lower 48 today exist only as small, fragmented populations in Idaho, Montana, Washington, Wyoming, and northeast Oregon. However, there soon could be an effort in Colorado to help the carnivores recover in that state. The Colorado legislature has been considering legislation calling for the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Agency to move ahead with a recovery plan for wolverines. The bill is expected to face its final legislative hurdle in the coming weeks. To discuss this initiative, we're joined today by Megan Mueller, a conservation biologist with Rocky Mountain Wild, a nonprofit advocacy organization working to bring them back, and Elaine Leslie, who was chief of biological resources for the National Park Service before retiring. We'll be back in a minute with Megan and Elaine.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. You can show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life, full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. National Parks Traveler has launched the National Parks RVing Guide, the definitive guide for RVers seeking information on campgrounds in the National Park system. The guide is now available free through the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. If you're a traveler who wants to explore the National Park system, you'll want this app. The guide is packed with details for campgrounds in more than 70 national parks across the country, searchable by park, state, or region. You'll also find feeds of the traveler's content, including our latest stories and podcasts. Download the National Parks RVing Guide and start planning your next trip today.
Welcome to the Traveler, Megan. Elaine.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Megan, what can you tell us about this? Why is this legislation before the Colorado legislature?
Let me start with a little background on wolverines in Colorado. So we had wolverines in Colorado until the early 1900s. They were eliminated from the state at that time by unregulated trapping and poisoning. There are fewer than 400 wolverines in the lower 48, and they're vulnerable to climate change and protected as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. Colorado has the largest unoccupied block of wolverine habitat in the lower 48. And as the climate changes, our wolverine habitat is projected to stay snowier and colder than other parts of the West. Colorado Parks and Wildlife estimates that the state could support approximately 140 wolverines. So reintroducing wolverines to Colorado offers a really significant opportunity to conserve this species. The wolverine is also one of the last native species missing from Colorado. We've done a really great job with reintroducing a number of other species. And so I think a lot of Coloradans would like to see wolverines back in the state. Colorado Parks and Wildlife started thinking about wolverine reintroduction back in the 1990s. They came up with a draft plan for reintroducing both lynx, Canada lynx, and wolverines. And then they ended up having just enough resources to do Canada lynx first, so they kind of put wolverine reintroduction on hold. And then I think the other important thing that sort of leads us to the legislative piece of this is that Colorado has a state law that requires that the state legislature approve reintroduction of any species that's protected under the Endangered Species Act. So Colorado Parks and Wildlife has been wanting to do this and planning it for a long time. And right now we're at a point where there's quite a bit of support for that in the governor's office and the legislature. And so we're really hopeful that we'll get a bill passed that will allow wolverines to be reintroduced in Colorado.
Yeah, you talk about Wolverines, and they're charismatic megafauna, although they're not that mega. They're pretty small when you're talking about grizzly bears or wolves or whatnot. But they've got this notoriety, is one word about them. The lore that comes down from the frontiersmen and the fur trappers about the tenacity of these small carnivores. I mean, Elaine, can you get into some of what makes this animal so unique and why it resonates when people talk about the wilds?
Sure, I think I'd add Hugh Jackman to that list, especially with the young folks and Wolverines. And I'd also add Doug Chadwick to that list of, I think his book was The Wolverine Way, which made a big splash. I guess that was probably maybe a decade ago now, but Doug really brought to light in the last 20, 30 years, the importance of Wolverines by studying them at Glacier National Park and then writing about them, that it just really captured people's imagination, since you rarely see this elusive animal. I've seen one once in all my years of being in the field, and it was a glimpse at best. But they are such an elusive animal, but they are amazing to watch play in the snowfields. They're not a threat to humans at all. And, they prey on mostly small animals. They're carnivorous. They, during the winter, will eat, an old elk leg they found somewhere, drag it into their den. Their dens are fascinating structures in themselves. So, they're just, if you look at them, they're just really beautiful critters and just very versatile. And I think, like I said, between all of these factors coming together, they've really captured the imagination of the general public. And if you even go back to Lewis and Clark times and their adventures, when they ran into a Wolverine, they didn't know it was a Wolverine. They just sort of described this amazing creature that was almost cat-like, but that they watched it play, they watched it prey upon animals, and they too were very fascinated. And that fascination, I think, just grew over time.
Well, I've got to ask you, you said their dens are fascinating. What makes them so fascinating?
They are. The way they're constructed. I mean, they'll certainly dig into holes and use whatever they can and to raise their kits. But it's just watching them in and out of these dens, and you can watch video of that, especially at Glacier or Alaska parks. And also another fascinating thing is that it's really hard to track these animals. It's really hard to find these animals because they're so elusive. So the information we do have from scientists is largely in part not only due to these keen observations and some anecdotal information, but actually building a trap for these animals. And I was fortunate enough to go out with Dr. Jody Hilty, who many of you know, and we were out in West Glacier or West Yellowstone out there at one of the trapping sites. And it was a log den, a very sturdy log den built that when the animal would go in, the trap would come down, the door would come open, would go down and trap the animal so they could fit it with a transmitter and GPS collar, all of that sort of thing, so they could track it. When we got to that trap, those logs, which were probably 7 to 8 inches in diameter, the most sturdy trap you've ever seen, were torn and ripped to shreds. That animal easily escaped after destroying something that I know that myself and another person could not have torn apart. And that was just looking at the claw marks, looking at just the destruction of this thing. It stuck in my mind for a very long time.
Yeah, I bet. One of the first stories I did as a freelance writer many years ago was about research in Grand Teton National Park to try and track wolverines and see how they were using the park. I should really take another look back to update that story to see what the findings were. But in recent years, we've seen wolverines make their way down into Mount Rainier National Park in Washington State, and really quite a fascinating, exciting development. And they've got some great pictures of a mother with her kits and going after some of the bait that was laid out by a trap or by a camera trap. Just fascinating, and they made it down there on their own. Megan, I'm just wondering, why do we have to help Wolverines move back into Colorado? Won't they make it there on their own? I mean, not too many years ago, or maybe it was too many years ago, 2009, 2010, I think, a Wolverine had actually made it down from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem into Rocky Mountain. They won't come back on their own?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're correct that in 2009, a radio-collared male Wolverine from Grand Teton National Park traveled over 500 miles through sagebrush and all kinds of cattle ranches and across multiple interstates, and came down into Colorado, initially into the area around Rocky Mountain National Park and in the park itself. And then he also traveled pretty widely across some other parts of the state. And males will often disperse long distances like that to find a mate. It's one of the other things I think is really amazing about Wolverines is just their ability to cover huge distances and to, cover a lot of ground, even in their home ranges in pretty remote and rugged and difficult terrain in the mountains. But the issue is that female Wolverines tend to stay closer to where they were born. So they'll find a territory that's kind of close to where they were born or as close as possible to where they were born. They're not as likely to make those kinds of long distance movements. We haven't had any documented evidence of a female Wolverine in Colorado in 100 years. And the space that they have to disperse across is just incredibly inhospitable. There's, like I said, interstates and lots of trapping that goes on and places where they could get shot on ranches. And it's just a pretty difficult journey. And, that was ultimately the fate of the male Wolverine that made it to Colorado. He didn't find a mate in Colorado and he dispersed and ended up in North Dakota, and he was shot by a rancher there. So
that's quite a trip. Grand Teton to Rocky Mountain to North Dakota. What's the timeline for this legislation? I mean, like we said in the introduction, it's passed the Colorado Senate. Any idea on the progress in the House, how long it might take there?
I expect it to be fairly quick because we don't have much time before the end of the legislative session in Colorado. It goes to the House Agricultural, Water, and Natural Resources Committee on Monday. And then the full vote in the House could happen anytime after that. So I expect we'll have a decision here sometime in the next couple of weeks.
And the governor is in favor of it?
The governor is in favor of it. Yeah, he's been very supportive of it from the beginning.
So if it passes both chambers and goes to the governor for his signature, what's the timeline after that before we see something on the ground?
It will take some time. They're planning a multi-year process to plan the reintroduction after the bill passes the legislature. So that will include Colorado Parks and Wildlife updating and finalizing a technical plan for how to do the reintroduction. It will include a stakeholder process where Colorado Parks and Wildlife make sure that stakeholders really support Wolverine reintroduction in Colorado. And it will include some coordination with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so it'll take, I'm guessing at least 2 or 3 years before we would see Wolverines on the ground.
Yeah. Where would they come from?
That's not completely decided yet because Colorado Parks and Wildlife hasn't finalized their plan for the reintroduction. Based on previous stakeholder meetings and draft plans, I anticipate that they would come from Canada and Alaska, but again, we won't know that until Colorado Parks and Wildlife finalizes their plan.
Yeah. Elaine, couple of questions. What's the population in Alaska like? I mean, I can't imagine taking Wolverines from any of the other lower 48 states just because the population is so fragile in those states. I mean, is Alaska a possible source?
Yeah, back in, I guess it was around 2010, 2009, 2010, and 11, the Park Service hosted a workshop of
all the scientists who could possibly be involved, USGS, Fish and Wildlife Service, the state, universities, and came up with a publication after that. I think it was published in 2012, where we went through all of this and went through all the technicalities of the restoration of the animals in Southern Rockies. And that's exactly what Megan said is we decided too that the best options were coming from Alaska, coming from Canada. Alaska has a pretty healthy population. I couldn't tell you what the numbers are. I think the numbers are around 300 as a general population of Wolverines, but I think that includes the lower 48 where there are not that many. So yeah, we would definitely not take them from the lower 48. Back in that same time, the Park Service also ensured that there were money for the surveys in Grand Tetons, Yellowstone, Glacier, those areas that added to another survey that was conducted by USGS and others. So like I said, they're such elusive creatures, it's pretty hard to get a real handle on the true numbers. But you're right about dispersal. You know, Rainier's had a couple litters, I think now, which is amazing. Yeah. But they've also been down in Yosemite, Cascades National Park, you know, so you're seeing national parks as these areas with vast wilderness, which I think these animals need. And that's why they do well in Alaska. Now, I don't know if their home range is in the lower 48 is comparable to what it is in Alaska, which can be up to like 230 square miles. It's probably not quite that much down in the lower 48, but it's probably that in Canada too. But, you know, like I said, getting the animals, doing the testing, putting them in quarantine, doing the genetics, all of those things, it's very complicated. And so we really laud the state for taking this on as the second half of this Lynx Wolverine plan that's been out there for so long. We're pretty excited that we've gotten to this place. And I think it won't be a problem finding Wolverines for the restoration process. And it'll be, you know, carried out over the course of years. So you're not just going to go and deplete a source in a certain area. You're going to be very careful about how you do that.
Yeah. I'm curious, you know, we say that bison, once upon a time, there might have been 45 million, 60 million bison across North America. Grizzly bears, there used to be thousands of them, tens of thousands of them. Do we know what a healthy Wolverine population once was in North America?
I certainly do not. I haven't read anything that talked about that. All I've read really from a historical perspective was the Lewis and Clark diaries, and then you know, fur bear trapper folks and talking about, you know, trapping them and trapping them out, and then there's all of a sudden it's upon us that there are no more Wolverines like in the state of Colorado. So no, I don't know that whole perspective, but Megan may know more.
I think that Wolverines, you know, they always exist at low densities on the landscape because they do need really large home ranges to find enough food because they're up in really harsh environments, especially in the lower 48 up in the mountains. So, you know, I don't know that anyone has an estimate of what the population numbers were historically. We do know that their range was much larger. So we know they were in the Rocky Mountains, they were in the Sierra Nevadas, but I'm not sure anyone has a solid sense for what the numbers used to be.
Yeah. And they have a low reproductive rate too. So, you know, it's not like a cat or a puppy, you know, or dogs where they just pump them out. It's not like that. They have very small litters.
Well, I'm curious, how do you do a recovery release in an area that has been selected? I mean, with the wolves in Yellowstone, they did a soft release of sorts where they built pens covering a couple acres and put the wolves in there and tried to get them to settle down and accept that as their new landscape. Elaine, you were saying with this Wolverine trap outside of West Yellowstone that the Wolverine tore it to pieces and, you know, walked away. How would you release Wolverines in a new landscape?
Well, I know this piece just from going on that planning exercise that the Park Service was part of back in the mid 2000s. And is that there would be a quarantine facility where the animals would be brought and worked up as far as the science is involved and the health checks and all that, and ensured that they're ready to go. And then looking at the pairings, the sexual pairings, and what the dynamics of a release might be. So that would be in one area. And then when everybody is satisfied that all the criteria have been met and the demographics or the way they want them to be, then I suspect the state will have certain release areas that probably won't be that well advertised, just like it wasn't with the wolves at first. And then they'll take these units, more than one, obviously, to these release sites and let them go. And, they're sedated in their travels, whether it's from Canada or Alaska to the quarantine facility. They're sedated when they're worked up from a health check and quarantine point of view. And then when they're ready to load up, I don't know if they'd sedate them into the carrying facility, but when they go, they'll be ready to go and, alert and able to take care of themselves. And I suspect they will not stay at that release site, right?
Probably not.
They're just crazy at dispersal. So they'll go pretty far and wide, we expect, but they'll have transmitters on and we'll be able to follow them.
Yeah. Megan, has Colorado Parks and Wildlife discussed how they might move forward with that, or waiting for the legislation to pass?
Yeah, they're definitely working on that internally. I know they're relying pretty heavily on the technical document that Elaine has been referencing, and then also additional updates and expertise. And I think, I did hear that they are talking about whether it would make sense to sort of drop off an elk carcass or something where they do the releases, to sort of have it be a soft release where they'd have some food at the beginning. But I think they're still working through all of those details and kind of talking to experts about what might make sense. And so, we have a really incredible state wildlife agency here in Colorado. They do a very impressive job with reintroductions. And so I expect they'll spend quite a bit of time getting that plan right before they move ahead with it. So it's hard to say now.
Yeah, sure.
And I'll just interject for a second. What I described was what's called a soft release. They may well go with a hard release too. I don't know how many Wolverine restoration recovery efforts have happened out there as far as releases that you can actually reference. Megan may know, but a hard release would be, hey, they get the animals, they do a quick health check, work up, and then they're gone. They release them. So, yeah, it just depends on what the state feels is best for the state, for the animals.
Yeah. In the Wolverines' last strongholds, the species is at a direct risk from climate change. Wolverines, as far as I know, depend on areas with deep snow through late spring. The pregnant females dig their dens into the snowpack to birth and raise their young. We're already seeing snowpack is in decline in the western mountains, a trend that is predicted to worsen with a warming climate. Megan, why is Wolverine habitat in Colorado expected to remain favorable as climate change continues?
So Colorado's mountains are higher in elevation than the mountains in much of the west of the Wolverines range in the lower 48. And climate change projections suggest that our mountains are likely to retain snowpack to a greater extent and farther into the future than some of the mountains in, for example, the northern Rocky Mountains up in Montana and Wyoming. Those projections make it look like there will be good habitat for Wolverines moving forward into the future. It's always, of course, somewhat uncertain with climate change, right? And I think predicting precipitation and snowpack is a little bit more challenging technically than predicting temperature changes with climate. So there's some uncertainty there, but the best available science that we have suggests that Wolverines should be able to do well in Colorado.
All those 14ers.
Yep.
Now, one of the things in preparing for today's show, I read that 94% of the Wolverine habitat in Colorado is on federal public land, and 68% of that habitat is on lands that is protected areas, such as designated wilderness, roadless areas, wilderness study areas. If somebody looked at a map of Colorado, where is good wolverine habitat? Where do you think we would see wolverine recovery take place on the ground?
It's basically the map of the mountain ranges in Colorado. So a lot of Colorado's mountains are protected as wilderness areas, roadless areas, national parks, and they all have excellent habitat for wolverines. So basically any mountain range in Colorado has habitat for wolverines.
Yeah.
And there are kind of, we have areas with bigger contiguous blocks of habitat. So there's an area in the northern part of the state that's kind of a big contiguous set of mountain ranges. We have an area in central Colorado that's like that, and then an area down in the south in the San Juan. So I expect those will kind of be core habitat areas for wolverines in the state moving forward, just because there's a lot of space for territories.
Yeah. Elaine, before you retired, you'd mentioned to me that there was, interest in helping wolverine recovery in Colorado. Are the national parks, Rocky Mountain National Park, Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve, are they suitable wolverine habitat? Is that something that the Park Service would support, do you think? And I know you can't speak for the Park Service, but from your days with the Park Service.
Yeah, we at the time felt both of those parks were suitable. I mean, Great Sand Dunes, it's kind of like what Megan said, is more like an island of high elevation there. It's not as big a block as what Rocky Mountain National Park is associated with, which has, adjacent, besides the park itself, so it's adjacent to quite a few mountains, and then the southern San Juans. But also, we have dinosaur, and, there's place that could be movement corridors. So yeah, I think the Park Service was certainly amenable at the time, and restoration is one of our mandates in our policy to look at-risk species. At the time I supported this study and this workshop, wolverines were not listed. So, what Megan said too is that, the state has a mandate for, as far as the recovery or restoration of listed species, that they have to agree. So it wasn't like we could just do this in Rocky Mountain National Park, and that would not have been appropriate for us to just push that through anyway, because they wouldn't stay in Rocky Mountain National Park. Hopefully one or two would have, but they would have been everywhere. So it needed to be a really collaborative effort. And that's what that workshop and that following publication represented, was everyone coming together in the best interests of wolverine recovery. And I go back to the reason we kind of started it was, we had some grant opportunities to put the workshop on and bring all these people together that normally couldn't come together. But also it was about the time when, Ken Burns and National Park and America's Best Idea. And if anyone remembers Terry Tempest Williams, I always credit her with one of the most poignant remarks made during that special, was to hopefully that over the course of decades to come and the future of the national parks, that the big R is the number one priority, and that's recovery and restoration. And so we really did, in my division and in the Natural Resource Stewardship and Science group, make that priority and try to help parks to the best of our ability restore species, whether plant or animal.
Wild question here. What happens if there's a change in administrations in Washington, D.C., and all of a sudden the Wolverines lose their ESA listing? Would Colorado still go forward, Megan?
That's a good question. If Wolverines lost their Endangered Species Act status, then the requirement for legislative approval would go away. So that would mean that the governor and Colorado Parks and Wildlife could move forward with reintroduction if they chose to do that. I think that they are likely to do that just because there's so much broad support and excitement around Wolverine reintroduction in Colorado. We have everybody from the Colorado Ski Country USA, which is a ski industry organization, to hunter and angler organizations, to conservation organizations, to county commissioners kind of supporting this bill. In the Senate, we got broad bipartisan support from Democrats and Republicans. So I think there's just a lot of support for it in the state, and I would hope that the governor in Colorado Parks and Wildlife would move forward with the reintroduction in that case as well.
Yeah, of course, Colorado just went through a interesting process in authorizing recovery of gray wolves in the state, and there were definitely pockets of opposition to that. Is there much opposition to wolverine recovery? I mean, they're not known for taking down livestock, healthy livestock.
Yeah, there's not the kind of opposition that there was around wolves. Some of the agricultural interests in the state are a little bit concerned about it, but mostly just because they're still upset about wolf reintroduction. I think they all recognize that there have only been 2 documented instances in history in the lower 48 of wolverines preying on livestock, and both of those cases they were sheep. So I think people recognize that wolverines are unlikely to have conflicts with livestock, and the sponsors of the bill, Senator Perry Will and Senator Jillian Roberts, have worked really hard to address those concerns and to make it clear to people that wolverines spend their time up in protected areas in the wilderness, in deep snow, in the mountains, in really remote and rugged country. So there just aren't likely to be a lot of conflicts with livestock or other human uses. And so I think that's why we have the support that we do, really, because no one is going to be negatively affected by wolverines being in Colorado, and a lot of people are excited about it.
Yeah. Has there been any discussion of possibly designating them as an experimental non-essential population in Colorado during the recovery years?
Yeah, there has. So that's actually written into the bill that they would be designated as an experimental non-essential population. And that has gone a long ways towards addressing concerns of stakeholders like the ski industry. They were concerned that having wolverines on the ground and having them protected as an endangered species might affect their day-to-day operations, things like that. So there will be that rule. And I think the conservation community initially was a little nervous about that. But as we kind of looked at wolverine habitat on the ground in Colorado, we started to realize, there's so much habitat that's in protected areas. Ski areas, for instance, are, I think, 0.7% of the wolverine habitat in the state. So I think we're really comfortable that wolverines can coexist with other land uses in Colorado. And so we ended up going ahead and deciding to support that.
Yeah.
I think another thing is, especially with the ski industry, who has in the past been a little iffy on this, everyone's learned a lot from the lynx restoration project in the state. Occasionally you'll go online and you'll see, a skier up on a chairlift, filming lynx down below playing or hunting or moving through. And I think the ski industry has learned that the restoration of these species doesn't have to be conflict with what their primary mission is. And I think people really get a kick out of that when they do get to see something like that. So I think everybody's learned a lot over the course of the last 20 years when it comes to restoration and what 10J means and experimental population and being an at-risk species.
So I'm wondering if we get to the point where wolverines are brought back into Colorado, whether it's in the northern part of the state in Rocky Mountain National Park or the surrounding forests or down in the San Juan Mountains, are there any risks that the animals would face?
Yeah, I'll start in because I know Megan has a lot of thoughts on this too. We've discussed, and I would say that one of the big ones is highway crossings. And as we discussed earlier, dispersal is so far and wide with these critters that I really worry about the fragmentation and the crossing of the highways, especially like 70. This state doesn't have nearly enough wildlife crossings. We're getting better. We got a couple out there, but we don't have nearly enough. And whether they're overpasses or underpasses for some of these smaller critters, not just for the big game, it needs to be for the meso carnivores as well. And that's a big threat. I'll let Megan talk more about climate change because, scientists disagree on what's happening in Colorado and the Southern Rockies. but also Colorado still allows for trapping. It's not leg hold trapping like you think from the olden days, although sometimes we still live in that period, I think. It's more like box traps or have a heart traps. And so I worry about incidental take. And that can be very stressful for an animal to be trapped in a like a have a heart or box trap for any length of time. So I worry about that. I worry about as M56, that animal that travels from Grand Tetons to Rocky and to Leadville and beyond, misidentification. What happens with wolves and this Wolverine is, oh, I thought it was a coyote. I thought it was something that was going to eat my cow. And they get shot. And Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't prosecute much on some of these, like the wolf that traveled from the Yellowstone ecosystem to the north rim of Grand Canyon. I thought it was a wolf. So I just worry about what happens to when these animals are misidentified or when they cross out of Colorado. Having the protection of the ESA is very important, and that's much better than it was. But I think all of those things need to be recognized as serious threats. And I think our most important thing, as much as it gives us gratification to recover an animal, we have to consider the welfare of those animals once they're on the ground and dispersing and trying to make a living out there.
Yeah, I think I would agree with the threats that Elaine mentioned. I think that wolverines will be fairly well protected on federal public lands, but because they can't make long distance dispersal movements in between mountain ranges, they are at risk when they're trying to cross busy highways like I-70, or when they come down to highways because they're attracted by a carcass that's been road killed. They're really vulnerable to being hit by vehicles. There's some really good work going on around that in Colorado. But for example, there's a group called Summit County Safe Passages working to build crossing structures across I-70. But that work is really expensive. And so one way people can help is by kind of donating to those kinds of efforts in Colorado. We know that trapping and poisoning were what caused wolverines to be lost from Colorado in the first place. And like Elaine said, we don't have a lot of trapping on public land in Colorado. We don't have as much as other states because we had a ballot initiative that banned certain types of traps on public land, but we still do have some. And then there is still trapping and poisoning that goes on private land in Colorado. So again, wolverines might be vulnerable when they're dispersing. So those are things that I think conservation organizations and the state in Colorado really need to work to address moving forward to make sure that wolverines can really thrive and do well in Colorado.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious, I don't imagine wolverine recovery would carry much of an economic boost. I mean, like we saw with wolves in Yellowstone, and all the wildlife watchers came out, and I think it pumps $35 million a year into the surrounding communities and into the park with people coming out hoping to spot a wolf or wolf pack. I don't think we've got to think about any economic benefits from wolverine recovery.
Yeah, I mean, that's hard to say, right? Because they're so elusive and hard to spot. I do think that they're kind of seeing a wolverine as a bucket list item for a lot of people. And so I could imagine there would be people coming to Colorado trying to see them, but it's hard to say whether it would generate, real significant economic benefits. And, we don't know that much either about wolverines' role in the ecosystem, but they are scavengers, eating carcasses, a lot of carcasses. And so they could have some beneficial ecosystem effects. But again, they're so elusive and hard to study. It's just hard to predict with those.
That was my next question. What are the potential ecological benefits? Elaine, any ideas?
Exactly what Megan said. And, they will eat small mammals, rabbits, weasels, all sorts of things, but they also are scavengers. People, will not say nice things about vultures sometimes or condors, but they have a role at scavenging and cleaning up things. And so I think what Colorado could do is, from an economic standpoint, is just that, hey, Colorado can tout itself as making ecosystems whole, putting things back, and that this is a state you can come to, maybe even grizzly bears someday. That's our next project, right? No, I didn't say that. But wolves and wolverines and, what we did to this landscape and trapping everything out, lynx and wolverines and, everything that we do. This state is working hard to put the pieces of the puzzle back together for intact ecosystems. And I think that alone brings a lot of people in to wander around these landscapes, whether at high elevations or low elevations, and just enjoy what we have here in the state.
I guess a lot of it goes also to, you may not see a wolverine, you may not see presence of a wolverine, but knowing that the ecosystem is made healthier and brought back to its original composition as much as possible. That's nice to know.
That is nice to know. And it's exciting to know that you could at any moment see a wolverine. It's rare, but you might be the lucky person who does. And I think, a surprising number of people saw the wolverine that traveled down to Colorado from the Tetons. There was a lucky photographer named Ray Raffiti who actually got a picture of him in Rocky Mountain National Park. So I think it's exciting to know that's a possibility when you're out in the wilderness.
And at the same time, there was a lot of online chatter of especially folks who were, like I said, hiking or whatever they were doing in the middle of that time with that high up. Is this a wolverine track? And they post those tracks online, those pictures, and there was just a lot of education that went on too, because a lot of experts would weigh in and say, no, I don't think that is, but oh yeah, you've got one for sure. And that's just exciting, knowing they're there. It's like, some people may never travel to Yellowstone and hear or see a wolf, but knowing they're out there gives you a great deal of satisfaction.
Yeah. Wolverine fever, I think in 2010, 2011, after that lucky photographer caught the picture of an actual wolverine in Rocky Mountain, other pictures came to the fore. And in the cases I remember, they were really badgers.
Yeah. Or marmots. We get a lot of marmots.
Really?
We love them too.
I mean, I saw the picture just the other day, the badger that people thought was a wolverine, and I can see the resemblance and whatnot, but a marmot?
Yeah.
So, Elaine, I know you're not working for the Park Service anymore. You're in retirement, so to speak. I mean, you enjoy retirement and work as hard as I do at the Traveler. And with your Park Service connections, is the Park Service watching what's going on in the Colorado legislature with any interest?
Yeah, they certainly are. And so is NPCA, National Parks Conservation Association, have very much been supportive. So, it's just a matter of time. Everybody needs to wait for this process to move forward. But yes, I know that the Associate Director for Natural Resource Stewardship and Science is aware of this, and he was very supportive of our efforts way back when. So they're watching it, but everybody, again, before you make any commitments, and you have a superintendent at Rocky Mountain National Park, and hopefully all these people will come together, and when it's time for the implementation strategy to set forth. And so, yeah, I mean, recovery, like I said, is part of the Park Service mission. So anytime you can put a species back into its natural habitat, that's exactly what we should do, and that's what I think the general public expects as well.
Yeah. Megan, you said it's not as controversial as the wolf recovery program in Colorado, and I know there was a big drive to get public support behind that. Any element of what the public can do in this situation?
Right now, the public can call their representatives in the Colorado General Assembly and just ask them to vote in favor of the bill. it would also be helpful moving forward for folks to pay attention to the process that will go on as Colorado Parks and Wildlife plans the reintroduction. We'll be keeping folks up to date on that on our website. That's www.rockymountainwild.org. I imagine there'll be lots of opportunities for folks to get involved in the future. And then, there are also several research and conservation organizations in Colorado who are really interested in partnering with Colorado Parks and Wildlife to monitor wolverines once they're on the ground in Colorado, and potentially through maybe a community science initiative. So I think there'll be lots of opportunities for folks to engage moving forward.
That's Megan Mueller, a conservation biologist with Rocky Mountain Wild in Colorado, and Elaine Leslie, a retired National Park Service Chief of Biological Resources. We've been exploring efforts to launch a recovery program for wolverines in Colorado. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll have to keep an eye on your website, Megan, to see how it goes forward once the House approves the legislation.
Thanks so much, Kurt. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Kurt. Thanks, Megan.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. As our guest mentioned, the Colorado legislature is expected to finish its work on the legislation in the coming weeks, and, if it passes, send it on to the governor for his signature. You can stay atop of the bill's movement at rockymountainwild.org. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchak. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.